start by way of introduction so that you know a little bit about my father, Charles. And first I just want to thank Sion and Denise and John and the anonymous donor who was able to bring my father here. It's very special to have both of my parents here in Los Angeles with me. And the book is, as you can see, quite large. I spent 4 years on it. My father spent close to 10, I think, starting on note cards. So, Sion, it's good it took us this long to get the event together because literally it is hot off the press. And we're very excited to be here presenting this. For today's lecture, with the time constraint and with the special interest that this group has, we've constrained the lecture to the architecture sections in the book, which you should realize architecture and weaving and storytelling run as metaphors throughout the book. And I'll just read my prologue to give a sense of the book as a whole. And we'll be doing other readings in the area, getting more into the stories in the book. In 2005, my father, Charles Paterson, sold the Boomerang, a ski lodge in Aspen, Colorado, that he began as a small log cabin built into a 35-unit hotel and continually managed since he was in his mid-20s. Upon retirement from over 50 years in business, he began writing a memoir on index cards, episodes he had previously recounted for me in 2002 in a series of video interviews he titled Short Memories of a Long Life. Our friend Hensley Paterson, after hearing one of his tales around a campfire in 2008, encouraged him to expand his memoir into a larger book. She also began asking questions that led us to look more deeply into the history surrounding his life's events. And so it began. He started to go through old trunks, drawers, and collections of photographs, commencing to catalog his life. One day I found he had laid out all his hats in an arc by the piano. His efforts were accompanied by the clarity of my mother Fonda's bright memories and research. Over their 44 years of marriage, she has kept her own files filled with articles and references that give context to his stories and those of his father, Steve Schanzer, survivor of 2 world wars. Steve, my grandfather, who's a central character in this book, was a legendary storyteller who inspired great affection and was an inspiration to many. When he emigrated to the United States in 1941, he changed the family name from Schanzer with a C to Schanzer, S-H. He said he wanted to drop the C in order to get the German out, as if he could banish from sight all the sorrows in his life that had been brought about by the Anschluss, Hitler's annexation in 1938 of our family's homeland, Austria. In this book, we have replaced the C in his name as a kind of restitution and amendment. My father Charles and my grandfather Steve are the central characters of this book. However, excerpts from the letters of other key figures help to fill its pages, including those from my father's sister, my aunt Doris Schneider, and a few rare memories from my grandfather Eva Beck Schanzer, who died in 1938. And so with so many contributors to Escape Home, this book has become a chorus. The principal voices are a father and son separated by war and reunited, who share great love and were lucky to have each other. Some details of these stories have been challenging to write and others to make sense of because even language can hide what has been lost, buried, or unspoken over the course of time.
At the time of the German annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, I was 9 years old. Our family lived in Vienna's 13th district. As I learned about that year and the violent manner in which the country was transformed almost overnight, I've changed the way I think about my childhood. I have no memory of the day the Nazis marched onto the Ringstrasse, but it altered my family life forever. We were thrown to the winds. My father Steve, my uncle Max Beck, my sister Doris, and I survived to tell the story. Who you see up here in that original picture was my grandmother, my father Steve, my sister Doris, and myself about 9 years old. My grandmother did not survive. In this book, we must all turn a page on tragedy, nevertheless, and recognize that vision, intuition, and hope are guides for people in the most terrible circumstances. I'm writing our story to give insight to what happened to people like us after our dispossession and to tell how somehow against all odds, we persevered and even thrived. I believe that young people today who see other times and their own difficulties can learn from our challenges, as I did from my father, that it takes courage and tenacity to carry on while you bring history with you. So what you see on the screen here is the Wien Museum. Last year we were asked to come to the Wien Museum because they had a exhibition of the Workmansiedlung. The Workmansiedlung was a very small enclave built by the city of Vienna in 1932. And they discovered that I'm one of the only remaining people whose family lived and owned the house in this enclave. And so we came there and we had a lecture, and they really wanted to see my book. But as you see, it just was hot off the press only now, and it wasn't ready last November. So this is a picture of the Workmansiedlung. As you see it on the top is a very small shot of what it looked like in 1932. And some of the designs, like a lost chair over here, or this is not a lost chair.
That's a Joseph Frank.
Joseph Frank's chair, that's correct. And those were in the Workmansiedlung.
Those are from the catalog for the massive catalog for the Workmansiedlung show. And if we could have the next slide. So this is an enlarged photo of that spread, and you can see how modern these houses were. If you can imagine this amongst what people were used to seeing in Vienna, the Opera House, all the Baroque architecture, the Schönbrunn, the Rathaus, all of these stately architecture, but quite from another time. And so this represented a real break from tradition.
I'd like to just read a small paragraph about that. Some of the most tangible memories of my early life include the physical environment of our house at the Workmansiedlung, Wojnowicz number 46. I remember all my play spots and running in the fields. Our family came to know to the new progressive settlement from the well-to-do neighborhood of Grinzing, which had typical 19th century stately architecture. The Workmansiedlung, as Carrie just mentioned, was entirely different. With houses designed by architects of renown, it was a social experiment in modern living in which my parents considered it a privilege to take part. Each house had its own garden plot, was part of a decade-long program underwritten by the city of Vienna to provide housing and elevate conditions for working families. Different architects came from all over Europe, and each would design their own designs, their own houses in this enclave, as we call it.
Adolf Loos, as the architectural director of Vienna's Settlement Housing Office from 1921 to 1924, helped determine the ideological underpinnings of the settlers' housing movement. He envisioned several goals: to uplift and stabilize working families, empower people to become self-reliant and independent, and to create sources of food production during a time of severe economic crisis and near famine after the First World War. Loos reported in a 1921 article in Die Neue Freie Presse that allotment gardening in Vienna had produced 1 billion crowns worth of food. That's, you have to take a couple zeros off to put that in dollars. During 1920 for the Siedlung houses. He wrote, "The garden is primary." And if I can just read the next part about Grog. Yeah. My father's house was designed by the architect Jacques Groag, a former student of Loos who worked with Loos on the well-known Mahler house in Vienna in 1928. Groag was also Jewish, and like my grandmother Eva, came to Vienna from Czechoslovakia. Groag's Workmansiedlung allotment afforded a space for a front and backyard to the duplex he designed. So the home had a large garden and was like a small townhouse that shared a common wall with its mirror version next door. My father's family were only 2 of 14 families who bought their residences at the Workmansiedlung. The other 56 houses were leased and gradually became incorporated into the city of Vienna's socialist housing. And just one note for architecture historians, this building on the far right that's at an angle, that's a Rietveld house, and Walter Loos did one directly in front. But under all of those three, if you, Voinovich-Gasse, yeah, that curve, that's the area that you were looking at in the picture.
Now what you see there with the arrows, the extreme right are the Adolf Loos houses. There are 2 duplexes. The next one in the middle is the Neutra house. It's the only house that Richard Neutra designed in Vienna, which was here. He did the rest of his work here in California, as most of you know. And the third left, on the left, is the Groag house, was our house where we lived. This is a picture of the Loos duplex. All the houses were different. So these are interior pictures.
You can go back one. So something that's interesting about the interior of the Loos house, can you see how the couch is built in, but it's kind of suspended over the bottom floor? He used these kind of just incredibly creative ways to make this space economical. It's a very small place. We actually had the privilege of going inside because somebody that we know was friends with someone who was living there, who's renting it from the city of Vienna, and probably gets tourists all the time coming and knocking at the door. But she let us in, and the way that she was able to live in this space and have so many different activities and things going on. She was actually using it partly as an art studio. She was a jeweler, she was a pianist, and all of that functioned in here.
Now the reason we show this is because my father was asked by his cousin, he was very close to, Baron Otto Panig, to live in his castle, and we were supposed to move in over here into this place. And my father and mother chose to go to the Workmansiedlung and live in this little house that we had over there, rather than move into this great castle. So we bring that up because it's of interest. Here's our house, our duplex. We were on the right-hand side. The left-hand side was owned by a Walter Stricker who went to Australia. And now the house is owned by people who were friends of my Aunt Claire Loos. We did mention earlier that my Aunt Claire was married to Adolf Loos. And they've punched through and made this one house. So that has become one dwelling.
Good idea if you have 3 boys.
And as you see here, this is an early picture of 1932. And the next ones we have, you could see more overgrown. This is already my sister and I on the right side.
Just a note also, in those houses in the top right of the photo, those were destroyed during the war. There were bombs that fell in the Workmansiedlung areas because very close by there were flak towers, those enormous, 10-story high concrete anti-aircraft. I don't know if anybody's seen pictures or been to Vienna, but they're so large they actually can't destroy them. One of the sons of our friends who live in my father's old house is an explosive engineer with the army, and they've tried to take them down. They can't. They physically can't explode these things. So they're all over the place. And that, of course, down here, this family shot. Claire is on the left, Ava, my grandmother, the kids, and Rosa Schanzer, my grandmother's...
My grandmother and myself, my birthday, I think it must have
been. It was your birthday. You have the crown on. I will just mention something else, that the shape of the photo, this is something that sort of permeates the book, are the photos being as much survivors as the people, because my father, in his childhood wisdom at age 9 when they were fleeing after the Nazis invaded, he went into all the photo albums and he grabbed as many things as he could. So things like this ended up getting yanked out of, vignette frames, and so a lot of the photos that we have, they're pieces and parts of a larger puzzle that we've spent years trying to put together, and we've solved a lot of mysteries. This is full of mysteries and answers for our family, and it's a journey of discovery also. Okay.
This was in a magazine called
Ideal Home.
Ideal Home, a British magazine, which we found in years later in Australia, and that shows the interior of many of the houses. In fact, that's our house.
These are just the Groag houses.
These are the Groag houses.
Yeah.
So Groag ended up in England, and he must have submitted those houses as one of his works. That was our bedroom, and the chairs, for instance, they were all different colors in a pastel, green and rose and blue and yellow. I remember the colors even.
And you'll see many of them are different, and that's sort of a Losian idea that every chair in a house should be different because everybody sits differently, and that a person would gravitate toward the chair that suited them the best.
This is a picture of Adolf Loos on the left and my grandfather, Otto Beck. And Loos was deaf, so they communicated with this strange contraption. One would talk into it, and Loos was listening to it. You could see the cord going. And long before hearing aids, I guess.
So this photograph was taken by my father's Aunt Claire, and she was a photographer, and she did most of her work that's known is all photographs of Loos. And this was from the Albertina Museum. We were lucky to get this. Next.
Another picture of Loos and Aunt Claire.
You'll see they're about 34 years difference in age. We also have books for sale that are a book that she wrote about Loos, and that's a wonderful portrait of him and has some rare photographs. This is in one of the Beck family apartments that was designed by Loos at New Year's. So there's my grandmother Eva, grandfather Stefan, Otto, Olga, and your Uncle Max.
Yeah. This is an interesting picture because this was the second apartment that Loos designed for my grandfather. I'll read you a little bit about that because it's in most of the books you find it. On my first return to Pilsen in 1994, we searched for one of the lost family treasures just to see it, the Beck's 1928 apartment, the second designed by Adolf Loos. We were traveling with my cousin Janet Beck Wilson from York, England, my Uncle Max's daughter, and her husband, David Wilson. From an address on an old letter, we found the apartment building which faces the park at Bennisplatz, now called the Square of Peace, Namestu Miru. Together, Janet, my wife Fonda, and I ascended the elegantly tiled staircase to the top floor. I knocked on the door of the apartment number 2 when a lady in white coat appeared. I handed her a note in Czech that a family friend from Pilsen, Will Zemler, had written out for me. It said that I'd lived there with my grandmother in 1938. I didn't explain any further what our circumstances were at that time. She smiled and invited us in. To my shock, the apartment interior had been gutted. The space was divided with plywood partitions and being used as a lavatory. My grandparents' apartment had been an exquisitely furnished place, as one can note from architectural books and from this picture, as were the Loos apartments that belonged to the Hirsch and Krauss families, our Pilsen and Vienna relatives. It had lacquered white paneling on the walls, fine furnishings, numerous oriental rugs and artwork. In 1994, Seeing the bones of the department laid bare was, to say the least, difficult. I only glanced in then. When I glanced in, I thanked the woman, but quickly withdrew, and with a heavy heart turned away. I could not bear to cross the threshold, and I was almost in tears when I saw what that marble space, as I remembered it, had become. Well, now we jump to 1958, and
Maybe
this is my...
Could I just fill in just
Oh,
for a
yes,
second?
certainly.
I'll just give you just a quick overview of what happens after fleeing Austria to Czechoslovakia to Paris to Australia and being separated for many years, 8 years from my grandfather. The kids being in Australia, having been adopted by the Paterson family, reuniting in New York, and then finding Aspen, Colorado because of the skiing, no less, like in Austrian tradition. Everybody was looking for good skiing. My father then decided to study architecture. He was in his 30s.
I was just out of the army, and I decided I really wanted to go back and do something more worthwhile. And I applied at Taliesin. A year later, I got a letter from Jean Masselink, who was Mr. Wright's secretary, and this is what was on that letter. And I treasure it, and it shows you a little bit about how, when I talk about Taliesin, you'll understand how that this letter makes a lot of sense. This is a picture of Hillside, which was the school, and I can read you a little bit about that. And I arrived at Taliesin the end of May 1958. I was now 28. Immediately I felt that this green valley with its gentle hills was a special place, and I experienced the comfort of knowing that I would like it there and feel at home. I drove my car up to an open court, behind which stood the imposing building that had been designed by Mr. Wright in the early 20th century for two of his maternal aunts, Jane and Nell Lloyd Jones. Originally called Hillside Home School, it was an expansion of their progressive coeducational boarding school and one of his first commissions. Later it became part of the Architectural School of Taliesin, with an adjoining drafting room and a theater. 3/4 of a mile away, over the hill, was the Wrights' beautiful home named Taliesin, after a famous 6th century bard, and also meaning shining brow. Aptly named, the house hugs the crest of the hill. One of the Wrightian principles is to integrate the building with the site, so it is of the hill instead of on the hill. The house, appearing from a distance as one approaches on the road, is mirrored on the water of a beautiful man-made lake with a waterfall cascading at its edge. Wright's genius in planning is evident everywhere. One more paragraph. At the base of the way leading to the house, at a fork in the road from Highway 23, is an enormous triangular and multicolored bed of flowers, giving the approach to the Wright home a magical quality. Mrs. Wright designed the garden, and soon I found out it was cultivated by the Taliesin apprentices. We spent every morning there for half an hour, and there were a lot of weeds to take care of. But we did, and it was a great discipline for us to get out there and get some fresh air and get out and get our hands dirty, which was perfectly all right. At Taliesin, we were learning by doing, and we were all assigned to different jobs. And one of my jobs one summer was to plaster the soffits that had been deteriorated through leaks in roofs in different places. And eventually we ended up remodeling Mrs. Wright's room, and this is off the main loggia, off the main living room house at the house. And I was plastering a wall that we had just built, and you could see beyond that wall where the corner glass window was going to go. And I believe that's you see the posts, and then the corner glass would be in that, wasn't there yet. But that's just an illustration of the work that we were doing. This was a picnic that we had one Sunday, I think it was. We used to have different fun things to do on weekends. And Mr. and Mrs. Wright were enjoying the garden at this picnic. This was quite interesting. One day, Carl Sandburg, the poet, came along to visit. And Mr. Wright and Carl Sandburg were heading into the theater where he was going to give us a small lecture. And as they came out of the car, which they'd driven over from the house, because the house was a mile away, I was standing in the corner by myself, and I had my camera. And Mr. Wright really never liked apprentices to take pictures of him, and he was really not very happy when we were doing that. So most of us would hide the camera, but I had it out there, and Carl Sandburg spotted me, and he grabbed a hold of Mr. Wright, as you see him there, and said, "Oh, Frank, let this chap take a picture of us." And Mr. Wright sort of looked at me, and it's half a smile and half a scowl. But I got the picture, and I was very proud of it.
Do you want to read anything about Mr. Wright?
Yes, I'd like to. I'd like to add a little more, because I'm sure you're interested in. There's a lot in the book about life at Taliesin. I'd like to read this because we have a lot of. We talked a lot in Vienna about the differences and similarities of Frank Lloyd Wright and Adolf Loos. And here's what I wrote. The comparison between Loos and Wright is fraught with dangers, differences in culture, clients' requirements, and environments. But as my father noticed and often discussed with me, looking at the two together brings out many interesting parallels. Despite what appears on the surface to be a great difference in architectural styles, the approaches of Loos and Wright resonate for me in a sympathetic chord. Loos wanted to teach people how to dwell, not just in his homes, but also in the world. Wright famously said, "I don't build a house without predicting the end of the social order." Like Loos and Wright saw his buildings as transformative, which would alter the way that people lived and usher in a new era. That picture is a drafting room, and in the foreground you see Louis Wheely. Well, Louis Wheely is right here. And I'm very happy to see.
Good to see you.
At that time, you were Alvin.
That's right.
That's right. I
In
remember quite well.
In the back is Nari Gandhi, we should mention.
Gandhi, yes. And
Cool.
he became very famous in India when he did a tremendous amount of work in India.
He's kind of compared to Antonio Gaudi in India.
And I might mention to you, Louis was always working. His drawings were absolutely fantastic. And he was always there and always working. You could see him there when the drafting room was empty. There was Louis working. All right.
Let's go back to the right photo. There we go.
Okay. We can move on to.
Do you want to read the thing about his personality?
Yeah, I'll let you read something.
we should just move on. Because we're gonna run out of time.
Okay,
Yeah.
we have to move along.
Yeah, we have 15 minutes, so let's go through your work.
Oh.
Okay.
All right, this is one of my first commissions. I did this at Taliesin for a client near Aspen. This house is about 20 miles from Aspen. It was an old farmhouse and it was a conversion. And in the next picture you could see the old house. That's how it looked originally. And we have more pictures. The interior, these tall doors, everything was walnut, solid walnut. Wow. And then it was a really wonderful house. The stairway was hung with these iron rods. You could look through the living room. And they loved to square dance, so they needed the doors to open out on the patio so that they could square dance outside and inside as well. This house I designed as an exercise for friends of mine who had a piece of land on Torch Lake. They owned another house, but they never built this. But I bring it up because it shows in the next picture the plan, how we learned at Taliesin to use a grid system. And you see that this is a square grid, but then it comes off at 45 degrees and it gives symmetry to the work because it gives you a guide, and we use it all the time in all our drawings. And it was a wonderful way to design a building because all the angles, the lines meet each other, and the space relationship grows from this, you might call, symbiotic method of drawing. This is a picture, a presentation drawing that I did for the birthday box. Mr. Wright always had on his birthday, everybody made presentations of a special work that they did. And I used my lodge, the Boomerang Lodge, which I'd worked on for years, especially at Taliesin, this is where I did most of it. And this shows you, again, the grid using a hexagonal form which created a 30-60 degree, and if you cut it in half, you had an equilateral triangle, and that's how the shapes of the pool area, the hexagon, came about. And it's a diamond module, is what we called it, the cross-section. This house I designed for a client in Vail, Colorado, and was one of the early houses that were built there at the beginning of that resort. One of the interesting things is the client's wife was a painter, and one thing I didn't do, I didn't give her enough wall space to hang the paintings. So what she did, she hung her paintings in front of the windows with wire, or use fishing lines, which you don't see. Hung a lot of her paintings in front of the windows, so she had places to put her paintings.
Okay, let's go to the next one, because we told the painting story. In 1961, Stanley Glenn, ski pupil and friend, who later sold my father what's called the paintbrush, and we won't talk about that, but that's a good story in here, commissioned my father for a painting studio to be located on the rise at the base of Red Mountain on Pitkin Green. The small chalet was tucked into the hillside overlooking Aspen and framing Aspen Mountain. One of your favorite small projects, you say. You completed color presentation drawings and an 1/8-inch scale plan with elevations. Go to the next one. But Stanley eventually decided to sell the land, quit skiing, and retire to Florida to paint.
Right, and here you can see for presentations, for simple presentations, we very often, Mr. Wright taught us how to do elevations on each side so you could visualize what was the view from each part of the plan. and it was a very clever way of doing things. And I did that as an exercise, and I thought it worked quite well. And again, the module here is a 4x4 square. And of course, using a 4-foot square, you put two together is 8 foot. Most of the building materials in those days, they still are probably a 4x8 sheets of sheetrock, and you could use that module very well in a construction and save a lot of materials. This was a house I designed on a piece of land that I owned on Aspen Mountain. It was a mining claim of 4.5 acres, and I wanted to tuck that into the hillside, and it was again an exercise. I never got around to build it.
Well,
But
I think that's sort of the point. A lot of the book is about designing and thinking about the future and dreaming, and architecture tends to be a way to materialize ideas. And the actual building of it happens or it doesn't, but that's not actually the point.
Right. Then there's another thing. You might see the elevations, of course, and then the little trellises. But you see, it's a square within a square. What I wanted to do was to set another square outside for the balconies for a very simple building, which is inside that area. This was a more ambitious project on Castle Creek, overlooking that chasm. The creek was way below, and the client required that from the kitchen area you had to see the dog run. And so there's the dog run.
In the lower
and
right.
You see it down below. Also, we had a very interesting idea at the time of having windows that pivot. In the summertime, it would be reflective. In the wintertime, you pivot the windows, they would be absorbed, the heat from the sun. But it never got built. They used an architectural office other than mine. Ling Po, who was a Taliesin, was one of the top renderers at Taliesin, and he always came, visited every year on his way between Taliesin East and West. And so one time when he came by, he did the rendering that you just saw, and here he's working at that rendering with me watching him and trying to learn something. He was a wonderful renderer, and he could do watercolors that he would use gin instead of water in his watercolors so they would dry quicker. This was a little house that I designed. In fact, my wife and I had our honeymoon in this house because we were married at their, it's almost an estate in Aspen, and it's a guest house. And it's a little hard to see, but for that house, I designed a Lowe's fireplace, which you'll see in the next picture. And there's Adolf Lowe standing in front of one of his fireplaces.
With his ear horn clasped in front.
This was a remodel of a lodge that was right in front of my Boomerang Lodge on Main Street in Aspen. As you see it on top, how it used to look, and then you see the same below. And there's one thing about this. I liked the prow very much. At that time, I was enamored with the prow. So this is a good shot of the Boomerang Lodge, and a more closer picture of the diamond module as you see it.
And the reason we put that in twice is so you could see how that hexagon is materialized in the pool, because the pool area was really a central focus of the hotel.
Right. We had a lot of fun in here. You might see there's an underwater window that we built in, which made the lodge famous in the early days. This was 1961, and I'm skiing into the pool, and we have people watching from from a lounge on below. You can see me sitting there with some guests.
You could see that the underwater windows flanked on both sides by mirrors. So you had this
Reflections
interesting...
of the pool on both sides. And the pool is a hexagon, and the room down there, the viewing room, was a hexagon, and then the fireplace was another hexagon, which was just beyond that picture. At the Boomerang, we used simple concrete block, and this was something Mr. Wright used a lot. He called battered block, and each one of the rows is offset a half an inch. And so you get the walls leaning outward, and you might notice the corner glass windows. The same thing, this is the upper lounge. And this has now been designated historic, even though I sold the Boomerang about 7-8 years ago. I want to go back 1 minute. That picture there is a hearse. And we converted it to take our guests. Before people were even thinking about taking guests anywhere, we took our guests to the ski area. But eventually we painted it light blue with a golden roof. The golden roof is already on here. This was an ambitious house which we actually built for another client and on Red Mountain near Aspen. And the wing going off is an indoor swimming pool. So it was really a great house. But it had been, after it was sold, was reconverted. I worked on that also. And what we did is we increased some of the spaces. But eventually it got completely redone and changed. This is my own house in Aspen. And again, this is taken from across the river on the right-hand side. And it has it's like a ship with the prows on each side of it. There's some interior of the early interiors. It has been changed now that we've remodeled, but this was a Rumsford fireplace. So the idea of the Rumsford fireplace was to build it narrow and high, and the idea, of course, is more radiant heat coming in the room, and you've got the flames going up, sometimes higher than that, and more pictures of the house from the other side. This is the entry side of the house as it looks now. Here's what I began my construction in Aspen in 1949 when I was 19 years old and bought the first property. The Boomerang was built around this little cabin, 8 feet by 16 feet. But at least I had a place to live. And before I went to Taliesin, I built this log cabin, and you can see the wonderful mountain right in front of us. Everything faces out towards that. We had a little pond in front where we used to have little fold boats, and we had fun with that. That was built with tar paper. This is the interior of the cabin, and we used it in the lodge. Later, as we moved to our house, we rented it, and the way it looked there, you see all the built-ins, which were, Mr. Wright loved to build in the furniture, and so did Adolf Loos, the same thing. We built the couches. I built the coffee table out of a couple of boards that were bent.
So this has been the architecture section of the presentation. As I said, there's a lot more in the book, but that we will go into a little bit more on Tuesday night at this other reading that we're going to be doing at the Standard, and you're all invited. It's at 8 p.m. and you can pay for parking at 8. It's $10, but it's very much worth it because it's valet. So this is where we'll end. Okay, thank you.
Believe me, I've read the book. I had to read it a little fast, but it's a really wonderful read, and it's incredibly well researched. And I know it took you guys you poured your heart and souls into it, and it shows in this product. It's very readable, very accessible, and captures the intellectual capital that you've displayed here today, as well as the warmth of your heart. So I couldn't recommend it more at $30. I wanted to just ask you a couple of quick questions, and then we'll open it up for our audience to ask a couple of quick questions as well. But clearly, growing up in the Workbund Siedlung was a unique experience. As you know, Mr. Neutra wrote and spoke a lot about how early childhood development is transformed by architecture, or the potential to have it transformed by architecture. And it occurred to me while I was standing up there that both of you could answer this question, actually. But I'd love to know how you think your architecture and your work and your identity was influenced by living in the Workbund Siedlung.
Well, you know, children learn a lot by osmosis. And when you live in a space, you may not be aware of it, but you're learning all the time and absorbing your surroundings, which must have influenced me quite a bit, because I veered towards architecture and towards building and construction. And that really, really is very important. I think that children have a surroundings that will help them in their future thinking.
Carrie, did you want to say a couple of words of how growing up in good architecture
I
influenced you?
loved living at the lot. I lived there until I was 5, and then we moved over to the other house. But there are so many stories that I could tell, but that pool is an amazing thing. I can't tell you how many hours I spent in the pool with my friends and down below the pool. And I think the house that you built, that we lived in and we're still living in, my sister, who's 4 years younger than me, is still living there right now in transition to Chicago, from Chicago to San Francisco. And it's just this incredibly accommodating space it's got a lot of family environment. It's so open inside, and yet it's got private areas, and it definitely influenced me, but probably that's a longer story.
Next book, right? That's the next book.
I'm not writing another book ever. Okay, I recommend nobody ever write a book. Do you know how painful this is? This is the most singularly painful experience of my life. I loved every second, but really, Dad, it was tough. Right? We're on the phone like every day, sometimes for hours.
So my next question is, and you touched on it briefly here, but you mentioned in the book about how Mr. Wright's public persona was very different than how you experienced Mr. Wright at Taliesin. And for those of us that only see the public persona, I'd love it if you would just expand on that for the crowd.
Well, to us as apprentices, he was a father figure to begin with. And since we admired him so much, when you saw his work, which was available for us to look at, to see, a lot of us were overwhelmed because we could never reach what we saw he was doing. But a lot of us tried, and some of us were encouraged, some of us were discouraged. Those who were discouraged usually didn't stay very long. I used to go home to teach skiing in the winter. They allowed me for that. And I came back every year for 3 years. And I loved it. I thought it was a perfectly wonderful experience. So I spent my summers there. So to give you an illustration of the question, in the public, there was an instance, for instance, for example, that I wanted to tell you about. Mr. Wright went to an opening of a new building in, I believe it was Minneapolis, at a college, and during the questions, somebody said, "How do you like our new building?" And his answer was 2 words: "Dynamite it." you know, this is his public persona. He was a great showman. He would be able to do that. At Taliesin, for us, he was encouraging, and he would teach us as we were going along. We'd be walking along a path. He'd pick up a flower, and he'd say, "Boys, look at this flower. Look at the construction of this flower. How can you apply this natural thing to a building? And look at a tree with the roots going down, how holding up this tree, and the branches are all cantilever," and things like that. So we were learning all the time at Taliesin. So I hope that answers the question.
It does, and there are many, 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 many more stories in the book. We titled this program War Right and Gemütlichkeit, partially because I wanted to be able to use my high school German, but mostly because I think one of the through lines and beautiful messages that's in the book, and I say that it seems ironic, or perhaps not, that you and your father, who were so displaced and so robbed of your family and of your social circle and of your home, literally and figuratively, that you end up in the hospitality business. And for those of you who've just been dying to know what does Gemütlichkeit mean, we turn to that ubiquitous source, Wikipedia, which is probably wrong, but I'm going to read it anyway, meaning a situation that induces a cheerful mood, peace of mind, with a connotation of belonging and social acceptance, coziness and unhurried. And I think that there is such a playful joy in your architecture and the work that we saw today and how you experienced it as a child, and clearly others experienced it in Aspen. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about how maybe architecture was or wasn't a way for you to reconcile some of the things and themes in the book.
That is a very good question. Thank you for saying that. My father was a Viennese, and Gemütlichkeit to him means anybody who came to the door to visit, to say hello, was immediately invited in, have dinner, have Turkish coffee, come in, stay for a while. And in the lodge itself, one of our overriding thoughts were, it has to be welcoming. It has to mean something when you enter a building. It has to say, "Welcome, I want to stay here. This space, I feel good in this space." So Gemütlichkeit means to me very much what you said, but I'm enlarging a little on it, that it means that you really feel at home in the space, that, or with the people that you happen to be in. I think that's the way. Do you want to add to that?
I think so.
So I'm going to reserve my final question, which I know there's a little
a
visual
slide.
aid associated, but let's see if we can take one or two questions from the audience. Down here in front, sir.
Well, you had mentioned how small the house you grew up in before it was, the two sides were combined, and then you showed some pictures. So how small was it?
Would you repeat?
The original.
The house in which you grew up, that was a duplex.
Oh.
But
That's right.
before the two sides were combined, when just the side that you lived in, it was referenced that it was small, and we saw some pictures, some very small space with the cantilever. How small was the space that your family residence?
It's interesting. It didn't seem small when I lived in it. It was small when I returned to it. It was still the same building. But the other side was a mirror image of the building. So when they combined it, then they had the space, like the living room was the living room on the other side, only it was a mirror image.
But it actually, it's comfortable when you walk in. It's got a seating area and a living room. You go up, you turn a corner, there's a kitchen, there's a tiny nautical, Los had these stairways that were just as big. I had a photo, but I didn't put it in, but just as big as 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, and it spiraled up. There's 3 stories. The master bedroom was on the top, kids on the floor below, one
on the second
bathroom.
floor, yes.
Yeah.
And the living space on the ground floor. I think this lady had a question.
Oh, one last question.
Hi. I was wondering, I came in a few minutes late, and my question you've already answered. answered, I apologize, I'll pick it up later, but I'm curious if you know, between 1893 and 1896, when Los was in America and Chicago, there's quite a bit of debate as to whether he ever actually met Frank Lloyd Wright. And if you've already
he did
considered
not.
that,
He did not meet him, but it's interesting. There was an architect by the name of Kassler who wrote that that Laws said that Wright was, I don't know
The
if I
be-
said,
Well,
I got right,
it's a note. Frank Lloyd Wright was inviting Lowe's to participate in an exhibition of organic architecture around the world. And there's more about that in the book, actually. There's a whole couple pages that you might enjoy.
but I know where this came from because Mr. Wright had invited Laws to work on the expedition of the 19, what year was that,
It would have been
1930?
33 or 34.
Exhibition
Oh,
in
32.
Chicago, was
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
And Laws was on his deathbed. He died in 1933, and he couldn't come. But there was a saying that Laws had said that Wright is the
best
The
architect of the Americas.
He said Frank Wright was the best architect in the Americas, the way he put it.
Yeah.
And they're very, in a lot of books, they're mentioned together. It's quite interesting.
Well, Barbara, you set me up beautifully to provide the sublime, and for me to now close by asking the ridiculous. And so I asked Carrie and her father, after spending a weekend reading this book, the James Lipton question kind of the movie, which is, who do you want you to play, or who do you want to play you in the movie version? And who do you think should play Adolf Loos and Frank Lloyd Wright?
So here's what I'll let you guess who these people are. Who they represent. Anybody can say the first one on the left?
You.
Very good. The second person? Ben Kingsley?
You mentioned a
His
Gandhi.
father. His
Oh.
father.
Steve.
Yeah.
He was bald-headed, had a mustache. The third person,
Right.
Sir Ian McClellan.
Somebody said it.
Right,
Right.
you're correct. And of course the fourth, it's easy.
Well, there are two options there because Christoph Waltz has that wonderful way of, introducing the German accent into the English language. So we thought that for Loos he could do that. Although Bill Nye has definitely got the Loos stare in all his photographs.
Well, I want to thank you again for coming all this way and
Thank you
doing
so
this
much.
wonderful program. We're now going to set up for the book sales, but please, before we do that, one more round of applause for Carrie.
Thank you very much, and we'll be glad to sign any books.
And answer further
Anyone else
questions.
interested?
Answer further questions.